Hi everyone, I'm Shelly and you're watching There's No Place Like Home. I'm back with another video, finally, and today's topic is identifying the sea beast of Revelation. Today's video is my next installment in my On Time, Re-Examining the End Times of Jesus' Return by John Paul Miles. Miles's book discussion. So I've been talking about this book for, well, now we're on the 16th chapter, so for quite a while. And this chapter is called The Sea Beast. I thought that I would have had this video out a few days ago, but there have been some really happy goings on. My daughter finally gave birth 2 days ago. She was 2 days late, so I know a lot of people will say, finally, that's not that late. I know, but we were all impatient, wanted to see him. So I have a grandson now, and he has a 16-month-old sister. So I'm just living the life. I love being a Mina. Like, that's what my 16-month-old has been calling me, is Mina. That's the name that I chose. But anyway, that's why I haven't been around. We've been really busy here, especially because, my daughter and son-in-law, they bought this house with us. So we are all living together. So I get to enjoy my granddaughter and grandson, and it's just been amazing. But anyway, let's get started on the topic at hand. So in today's chapter, we're going to be taking a look at one interpretation of the sea beast. I say one interpretation because there are some differing opinions. The approach that John Paul Miles takes is that the sea beast represents Rome and its 7 Caesars. Another interpretation that some people have is that the sea beast was actually the zealots, the Jewish zealots. And as John Paul mentioned in one of the earlier chapters, you can actually check out Adam Marshall's stuff. He gets really into all of that history and everything. But since we are reading On Time, we are going to focus on Rome as the sea beast for today. So right away in the beginning of the chapter, he starts with Revelation 13, 1-8. One more thing that I wanted to say is if you're new to watching these videos, I highly recommend that you go out and you buy this book. It is so good. It really filled so many things in for me when I was first learning about full preterism. This was the first full preterist book that I ever read, and it clarified things for me in a way that I don't think that I would have understood so many things if I wouldn't have read something that, it's easy to read, but it's also very full of information. Now, you don't have to have this book, though, in order to watch these videos, obviously. I try to make them stand alone, and I will read some excerpts from the book, but you don't have to have the book in hand in order to understand what I'm talking about. So I'm sure that most of you have gathered that by now. But John Paul starts out the chapter with Revelation 13, 1-8. So I'm going to start there as well. Then I stood on the sand of the sea. I saw a beast coming up out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads. On his horn were 10 crowns, and on his heads blasphemous names. The beast which I saw was like a leopard, and his feet were like those of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. The dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. One of his heads looked like it had been wounded fatally. His fatal wound was healed, and the whole earth marveled at the beast. They worshipped the dragon because he gave his authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast? Who is able to make war with him?" A mouth speaking great things and blasphemy was given to him. Authority to make war for 42 months was given to him. He opened his mouth for blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his dwelling, those who dwell in heaven. It was given to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. Authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation was given to him. All who dwell on the earth will worship him. Everyone whose name has not been found written, who has not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who has been killed. And next he has Revelation 17, 9-10. Here is the mind that has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. They are 7 kings. 5 have fallen, the one is, the other has not yet come. When he comes, he must continue a little while. Now, as I mentioned, we are going to be going over the identity of the sea beast today as a representation of Rome. And specifically, this interpretation of the sea beast has a lot to do with the Neronian persecution during the Roman Empire. And my cat is already starting. So, what it says here is that the sea is seen as symbolizing foreign nations and enemies of God's people, and Rome with its vast rule over many nations and people, and that became an adversary to Christianity during the Neronian persecution. Now, I will say that I do believe that most preterists look at Rome as being the sea beast. So the idea of the Jewish zealots being the sea beast is not quite as popular. I just had to pause it because I had a tickle in my throat and now my eyes are all watery and my mascara is probably going to be running everywhere. But a story of my life, right? Anyway, so this interpretation of Rome being the sea beast is by far the most popular, at least that I know of, within the preterist community. The idea of it being Jewish-led zealots is not quite as prominent. And, we'll find out in this book that there are a lot of very cultural and historical aspects to the things that happened in Rome during this time that seem to lend credence to the idea that the sea beast could possibly have been Rome. Now, perhaps in the future, I will do another video about the Jewish-led zealots being the identity of the sea beast. And that is not something that I have researched that much of yet. I have done research on the Jewish-led zealots being the sea beast. And I find that very, very intriguing. But John Paul, he shared so much information here, and there's a lot of evidence here that certainly seems to point to Rome as well, which is why there are people, people like David Chilton, who wrote The Days of Vengeance, which was this huge exposition on the book of Revelation. He believed that Rome was the sea beast. So, John Paul is in good company. Anyway, so what he says next is that this is on page 155, by the way, in the section called 7 Heads and 7 Caesars, if you're following along. The description of the sea beast in Revelation 13, verses 1 to 8, includes elements that align with Rome and its emperors. The beast has 7 heads, with blasphemous names on its heads. In Revelation 17, 9 to 10, the angel explains to John that the 7 heads represent both 7 kings and 7 mountains on which the woman is seated, referring to Rome's 7 hills. So yes, so Rome is known as the city of 7 hills. Interestingly, someone told me that Jerusalem also has 7 hills, but that's not something that I ever, looked into just yet. Then he goes on to say further down the page that the Romans did not consider Otho and Vitellius to be legitimate emperors, but regarded their takeover of Rome as a rebellion. Now, the thing is that the sea beast, it had blasphemous names and it demanded worship. And one very interesting thing about the Caesars is that they demanded worship because they considered themselves to be gods. And this is something that I have shared in a lot of my other videos, it wasn't just Rome, all over the world, the royalty, the rulers of these nations very often considered themselves to be either gods or descendants of the gods. So the Caesars were not alone in this, but actually, John Paul says here that some of the Caesars, so apparently it wasn't all of them. And one of the Caesars who did do this was Titus. He also proclaimed himself as a god. And the Romans, they actually enforced this worship of their gods and their idols. So in this way, they led the world to worship the dragon, which, who is called Satan. And let's just remember, you might be saying, well, okay, but worshiping other gods and goddesses isn't, necessarily worshiping Satan. What we need to remember is that anything not of God is of Satan. So that certainly would seem to fit the bill here. So if I just go back to Revelation 13, it says that it was given to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. Authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation was given to him. Now, in the section called Unconquerable Beast on page 157, John Paul shared some very interesting information about this. It says that in an inspiring and dreadful speech, Roman King Agrippa attempted to persuade the Jews to avoid war with Rome, illustrating how the Roman Empire decimated all empires that stood against it. And I think that, we might not have learned about the destruction of Jerusalem in our history class, but most of us have at least learned some of the history of the Roman Empire. I don't know how much you remember of that from school, because to be quite honest, as much as I love history now, I did not love it in school because it was presented in such a boring manner. But most of us at least would remember that the Roman Empire was considered at some points to be unconquerable. They just spread and spread and spread, and they took over so many nations. Now, what John Paul says here is Rome had conquered much of the known world, including the territories formerly belonging to Babylon, Media, Persia, and Greece. And what do those things have in common? Well, those are the descriptions of the sea beast characteristics, because in Revelation 13:2, it says that the sea beast resembles a leopard, bear, and lion. And those animals actually symbolized not only different regions of Rome, but it adopted elements from Babylon, and I think it says Media, but I always thought it was Medes. I don't know, Persia, and then Greece. And again, here it says that they're denoted by the lion, bear, and the leopard, respectively. So we have another aspect here that really does seem to fit. If there is a part of Rome that has incorporated all of these symbolic animals into its culture, into its religion, that would make sense. And then it says the Roman legion standard bearers even wore skins of lions, leopards, and bears. So next we're going to talk about the persecution of the saints. And as I mentioned before, this was mainly about the Neronic persecution. So the persecution, there my throat goes, by Nero. The Emperor Nero actually did make war with the saints. A fire broke out in Rome, and because there was such a huge backlash of this fire that broke out in Rome, Nero, he blamed the Christians. And it says the Roman Empire's oppressive actions against Christians were seen as an attack on Christ himself. Now, John Paul says that this persecution lasted for approximately 42 months. And what did it say in Revelation that we just read? It said authority to make war for 42 months was given to him. Now, as far as I know, this persecution of Christians only was confined to Rome, but I'm sure that it had other consequences throughout the empire. I'm actually going to share with you something from I found this book at a flea market. It's a dark history, the Roman emperors from Julius Caesar to the fall of Rome. And so I thought that I would just share with you what it says about Nero. So let me see. Okay, it says here, it's probably going to be backwards for you, but it says Emperor and Antichrist. This is where the whole Antichrist scenario kind of gets mixed up again, because there are so many Christians who think that the Antichrist is in the book of Revelation. And that's because so many people call the beast of Revelation the Antichrist, when in fact I don't believe that there's any reason to make a correlation between the two. The Antichrist was only in 1st and 2nd John, was not in the book of Revelation. But if Christians are going to get confused about that, you can be sure that secular society is going to get confused about that. So the Antichrist, it sounds very suspenseful. It sounds like something that is going to grab people and get their attention. So Antichrist, yes, is used an awful lot, but it's not in Revelation. But anyway, what it says here is Claudius is believed to have been concerned about the small but growing Christian community in Rome, but it was Nero who organized the first real crackdowns. It was he who brought about the martyrdom of Saints Peter and Paul. The emperor's guards rounded up scores of Christians, and while some were thrown to savage dogs to be torn apart, others were nailed on crosses or burned in fires. So small a sect could hardly have been seen as a real religious threat to Rome, but it suited Nero to scapegoat the Christians for his own reasons. He claims that they had been responsible for the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. And that helped distract public attention from suspicions that he himself had been to blame. As a wave of similar persecutions drove the Christians underground, they communicated secretly using a code based on Gematria, or Gematria, I'm not sure. At its most exalted level, this was a numerological theory exploring the relations between the Hebrew language and number systems, and it provided the basis for a code. For Nero, the figures came to 666, the number of the beast, in the book of Revelation. Many early Christians did indeed see the Emperor Nero as a reincarnation of the Antichrist. So I just thought that was interesting. I wanted to share that bit of history with you. And, this is even in a secular book, and they're even admitting that Nero did persecute the Christians in Rome. So the next characteristic of the sea beast is the mortal wound and the resurrection, and that's on page 159, and that's the name of this section. And if you're familiar with the book of Revelation and what it says about the sea beast was said to have a mortal wound that was healed. And John Paul says this can be associated with Nero, the sixth Caesar, who inflicted a mortal wound upon himself by stabbing his throat with a dagger. And this actually happened because he knew that he was going to be captured and that he would be beaten and just probably tortured, and he didn't want that to happen. So he stabbed himself in the throat rather than be placed in the hands of the enemy. So he did have a mortal wound. So we have that. But then John Paul says, however, the beast is resurrected from the bottomless pit and its mortal wound is healed. And that we can find in Revelation 11:7, 13:3, and 17:8. Then he says, in the legend of Hercules, when one head of the Hydra, Leviathan, or sea beast was cut off, two grew in its place. Vespasian and Titus eventually rose to power as joint Caesars, bringing stability and restoring the empire. The resurrection of the severed head and the kingdom of the beast can be seen as the revival of Rome from the brink of destruction. So, in this perspective, it was the joint Caesars, Vespasian and Titus, who actually were the resurrection of Nero, and it was not Nero himself who was resurrected after his mortal wound. This reminds me, though, when I was reading in this book about Nero, it did say that after his death, there were people who were coming about pretending to be him. So it says right here, the tradition of worshiping emperors as gods was widespread. A number of reincarnations were claimed. And it says I believe, let me see. Yeah. A number of reincarnations were claimed, and this is people pretending, pretending, but claiming to be the reincarnated Nero. It says one liar-playing lookalike turned up in 69 AD, and he very nearly succeeded in persuading the Parthians to start another war. Another emerged around 80 AD during Titus's reign, when the Romans' eastern frontier was unsettled throughout this period. And then finally, some 10 years after that, a third pretender appeared, claiming to be Nero, bringing about a full-scale rising in the east. So now, obviously, the one in 80 and then the one around 90 AD would not be the ones in question. But we do have in 69 AD, there was a liar playing lookalike who almost, persuaded the Parthians to start another war. So, I mean, this is just something that I happened to notice as I was reading this book. And it's not anything that I've really given that much thought to, but I do think that it's interesting, that it says that there was a resurrection, and then there were people at that time who actually believed that Nero was still alive and almost started a war over it. All right, next we're going to talk about the two witnesses. Now, I want to point out here that I'm only sharing the highlights of this chapter with you. John Paul shares so much more information in his book than what I share here in my videos. So honestly, if you want to, all of the details, and I'm sure you have other questions of things that I'm not sharing on here. What I am doing here though is I am just sharing the things that really stand out to me and the things that help to explain it the best. But there are other sections in here that I have not covered that I encourage you, to get the book and read it if this is something that you're really interested in. But I'm just going to jump to the two witnesses right now because people always ask me about the two witnesses, who they are. And so this is an interesting perspective on that. And it's on page 161. And he said, the two witnesses seem to point to the prophet Jesus ben Ananus, whom Titus killed with a Roman stone catapulted at the beginning of the siege of Jerusalem. Although Revelation said there were two witnesses, it mentions them sharing one body, possibly indicating that the spirits of two prominent prophets shared the body of Jesus ben Ananus. And it says Revelation 11:8. The Greek literally reads, and their body will be upon the street of the great city, which is called spiritually Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. In a couple of places in the Bible, men operated in the spirit or manner of a prominent prophet. John the Baptist came in the spirit of Elijah, and I just made a video about this not too long ago. Matthew 17:9-13 and Luke 1:16-17. And Elisha received a double portion of Elijah's spirit in 2 Kings 2:9. So perhaps the spirits of two prominent prophets shared the body of Jesus ben Ananus. And it is a possibility because, just as we were looking at Nero's death and the mortal wound and the possibility that it was the joint Caesars who would have been considered the resurrection and of not of Jesus, or not the second resurrection, but the resurrection of the sea beast after the mortal wound. So if we look at it that way, and if we look at the possibility that there were two spirits in one body in Jerusalem during that time, we need to remember Revelation is not meant to be taken literally. So there are so many different figurative aspects to Revelation, and we need to understand that. And it can be hard to separate yourself from that mindset, especially if you grew up a Christian and were taught always to take it literally unless it says otherwise. That's what I was taught once I became a Christian. But once you understand that the book of Revelation is written, as we learned in the very first chapter, I think it was the first chapter, that these things were signified to John. So this is symbols. This is symbolic language, and it was very often used in Bible prophecy was symbolic language. So, if you are looking for two literal people who were in Jerusalem, could it be possible that it was two spirits sharing one body? And here we have the Greek that actually literally reads, and their body, singular, will be upon the street of the great city, which is called spiritually Sodom and Egypt, which we know now is Jerusalem, where also their Lord was crucified. So I think it's certainly a possibility. And, just as with the sea beast, it's not the only, interpretation of the two witnesses, but I think it's something that is definitely worth mentioning. So the next section is Apollyon and the locust armies. And, let me see. So earlier in the one section that I didn't share, the eighth king, because the book of Revelation does mention an eighth king, and it says, I'm trying to find this, the eighth king is identified as the joint reign of Vespasian and Titus, both of whom became the eighth Caesars and desecrated the Jewish temple, similar to Antiochus Epiphanes in the past. So it's interesting that here the eighth king is identified in a joint reign of Vespasian and Titus, and then the two witnesses, possibility of two spirits in one body. So we've got two aspects of two in one going on here. But John Paul says on page 162 that both the eighth king and Apollyon came out of the bottomless pit. So there seems to be a connection between the eighth king of the sea beast and Apollyon, the king of the locust armies, that is in Revelation 9:11. So Apollyon led the locust armies out of the abyss to torment those without God's seal for 5 months. The Roman god Apollo considered locusts sacred creatures. Titus, the leader of Legio 15 Apollinaris, or Apollo's 15th Legion, besieged Jerusalem for 5 months before destroying it. So there we have yet another aspect that certainly does seem like it could fit the prophecies of Revelation. So the last section is the final judgment of the sea beast, and this is on page 162. I'm so terrible with telling you all like what page I'm reading from and what section I'm on. If you're following along, I apologize. I'm just, it's not something that I think about very often. Every now and then I'll remember to tell you what page I'm on, but I'm on page 162 now. The final judgment of the sea beast. And it says the sea beast would eventually be thrown alive into the lake of fire. Now, John Paul has a very interesting take on the lake of fire. And this is something I actually made a video about this perspective quite some time ago. And it was a video about the lake of fire and Mount Vesuvius. I'm going to link that in the description. Or maybe I'll link it at the end of the video when I put the little thumbnails up for you to click on it if you want to watch it, because I did talk about this aspect. And I've also talked about, another interpretation for the lake of fire, but John Paul's is actually very interesting. The lake of fire was a picture of the afterlife punishment that awaited the enemies of Christ. Recall that Satan was also cast into the lake of fire. The sense in which Rome was thrown alive into the lake of fire occurred in 79 AD when Mount Vesuvius erupted and instantly destroyed 2 entire coastline cities of Rome while the populace was inside. Have you ever heard of Pompeii? That's what this is talking about. So so it did occur 9 years after the destruction of the temple. However, in this perspective, even though it was 9 years after the destruction of the temple, the sea beast was still destroyed. It just didn't happen by 70 AD. So, and that's something that there are a lot of preterists who do believe that this had something to do. It was in 79 AD. So I always say, everything was fulfilled by AD 70. But at the same time, it also means, in my opinion, that these prophecies were either fulfilled or they were they were started. For example, I think that the Great White Throne Judgment, I think that it wasn't something that was just a once and done thing and was fulfilled. I think, and I'm sure I might have a different opinion on John Paul about the White Throne Judgment. We'll find out. Because I read this book last year. So anyway, I believe that the White Throne Judgment is something that actually no, I think he does agree with me. It started in 70 AD and now it continues on for each believer. Or every person actually as they die, but that it was begun. The judgment began. There was no judging before AD 70, but after AD 70, the judging began. So if you look at it that way, that the wheels, were set in motion for the destruction of Rome, and it was finally, consummated in 79 AD. Then he says, interestingly, Satan was also thrown into the lake of fire a year after the volcanic eruption, when a fire destroyed most or all the satanic temples in Rome. So that's a very interesting perspective too. If you are thinking about the lake of fire as being, a physical, actual fire, and I know a lot of people believe the lake of fire is just judgment, but in this perspective, the lake of fire is actual fire. And here we have Rome, if it was indeed the sea beast, destroyed by fire, well, by lava, in the volcanic eruption of Mount Vesuvius. And then just a year later, we had all these satanic temples in Rome that were completely destroyed after another volcanic eruption. Or was it? No, it was a fire. It wasn't another volcanic eruption. It was a year after the volcano eruption, but then there was a fire that destroyed most or all of the satanic temples in Rome. So that's an interesting way to look at that, something to think about. So what he says lastly is the conclusion on page 163. In summary, the sea beast in Revelation symbolizes Rome and its 7 Caesars. The sea beast's actions, demands for worship, unconquerable nature, and the persecution of Christians align with the Roman Empire's attributes during the time of John's writing. So, the sea beast's actions, demands for worship, and we do know, as I told you, that some of the Caesars, they considered themselves to be gods and they demanded worship. The unconquerable nature, I think that most of us know, the Roman Empire, it just spread far and wide because it was unconquerable to an extent. The persecution of Christians, that did happen. Again, that happened in Rome, not Jerusalem. But there was still a Neronic persecution. They did horrendous, awful things to Christians. And according to John Paul, that also happened for 42 months, which would align with the prophecies of Revelation. So I think this was a really interesting chapter. The next one is going to be about the 10 horns. And I should get this one out faster to you than I did the last one, but I think I had a pretty good reason for not doing videos for a few days. But I've just been enjoying my grandson and granddaughter. I love her to pieces. Anyway, that's all that I have for you today. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed and would like to hear more of what I have to say, I would love if you would do that. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them down below. And if you like my work and would like to become a channel member, I will leave a link in the description box for that as well. Or you can just click on it right on my channel page. And I hope you have a great day.